Crystal chandeliers scattered light like fractured gold across the ballroom, a soft chord of piano hovering above conversations, and the faint perfume of roses and champagne lingering in the air. And she was sitting alone at a small table that everyone assumed they already knew. The hostess lights made the edges of her coat shimmer, the napkin by her hand smelled faintly of lemon, and the murmur around her sounded like an ocean of polite secrets. Emily Carter, 34, investigative reporter at a major business weekly, had coffee stains at the edge of her notebook and a habit of tapping her pen when thinking, and she kept her gaze low, as if she were cataloging every expression in the room for later. A stranger slid into the chair opposite and whispered close enough for only her to hear, "You are no longer alone. Pretend that you are with me." The sentence fell into the cavern between them like a coin into water, setting circles of possibility in motion. The promise in that whisper felt like an invitation and a warning at once. What started as a favor for an evening could unravel an entire empire of offshores, signatures, and donations that nobody wanted exposed. And you, where are you watching this from tonight? Let us know in the comments. Welcome to this channel where true choices and impossible lies meet. A phone buzzed in the distance with an email that would change everything. From the moment he spoke that line, the night shifted. The piano hit a minor key, and the gala glittered like a stage set where every smile had a script. Emily did not answer right away. She tucked a stray air behind her ear and studied the man as if he were a byline she had not yet placed a name next to. He had the measured calm of someone who held other people's money like a secret, the kind of composure that made boardrooms pause. He wore a suit that smelled faintly of cedar and new leather, and his eyes were a steady slate. He introduced himself as Julian Hart, Chief Executive Officer of Hartwell Holdings, a name that opened doors and silenced criticism. Around them, the gala spun on luminescent and unaware. This was the moment the story began to bend. In the weeks that followed, Emily would tell herself she had been curious that night, and that curiosity had a price. Julian would tell himself he had offered a small fiction to protect a truth that no fiction could conceal. The city outside glowed with its usual indifferent lights, but beneath that surface, a ledger waited, with a signature that did not belong to the person who had signed it. Her pen became a symbol, and the golden invitation he slid across the table became a prop in a larger play. The object returned again and again, an engraved pen with initials that read like an emblem of status and false promises, the pact. For one night, for one photograph, for one public performance, they would pretend to be a couple. She would gain access to rooms where donors whispered and confidential files were carried in leather folders. He would gain a companion for appearances and cover for a rumor the board of Hartwell wanted to silence. The first act of pretending created a doorway. Emily accepted with a reservation and a journalist instinct that did not yet know how deeply she would be pulled in. The agreement came with rules, spoken in polite sentences. He asked, "Please do not introduce me as more than a guest." He asked, "Keep the arrangement private." He asked, "Trust him for one evening." They shook on a delicate fiction that smelled faintly of aftershave and citrus gum. In the small hours after the gala, Emily walked home under the city lights, thinking about signatures and balance sheets and the way people used charm like a currency. She wrote a scene in her notebook, a sentence that read, "Everything began the night she sat alone and agreed to lie for the truth, and then left it there, like a promise." Her backstory was a slow accumulation of choices. She had grown up in a modest suburb, her mother a schoolteacher, and her father a mechanic who taught her that the truth had value beyond applause. She found words early and moved to the city with a single suitcase, a battered typewriter, and a relentless curiosity. In university, she studied economics and political science, then spent years in regional bureaus, learning how to listen to numbers as if they were people. Her reporting had cost her friendships and comfort, but had gifted her credibility, and a few bruises she wore like medals. She had a taste for black coffee, cold pizza, and late-night calls with sources who sounded like they were reading from confessions. Her mother called once a week and asked if she was eating well. Marcus Lee, her editor, called more often and sent headlines that smelled like urgency. Emily had an old scar at the base of her thumb from a door that once slammed during an argument with a boyfriend who did not believe in her ambition. That scar reminded her of risk. Her apartment smelled perpetually of paper and something citrus from a candle she rarely burned. She kept a small box under her bed with documents she could not publish until she could prove them. Her career had been built on a combination of persistence and the humility to know when to ask for help. That humility now felt like a fragile bridge between her instincts and the temptation Hartwell offered. Julian Hart came from a different map. He had an education that read like a CV of privilege and a childhood that had taught him to hold doors open and close them behind people without apology. He often said he liked numbers because they didn't surprise him the way people did. He collected modern art and expensive watches and had a reputation for being implacable. He had a soft spot for classical music, a fact his assistant, Nora Alvarez, would joke about and secretly tolerate. His backstory had a quieter ache he rarely spoke of, a father who built a company and expected his son to become its unblinking steward. Julian learned early that power was both a tool and a garment to wear depending on the room. He made decisions with the calm, surgical certainty of someone who believed in systems and outcomes. Yet he had a childhood memory of being the smallest boy by a lake, watching swans refuse him their space, a memory that never left him and sometimes softened his strategies in private. He believed he protected the company, the investors, and the people who worked for him. Even when the cost was a moral erosion, he pretended not to notice. His circle included people who were as polished as him: Henry Blackwood, chairman of the board, who could make a donation disappear with a single sentence; Victor Hale Hartwells, chief operating officer, who smiled in the language of deals and kept his phone on a different plane of secrecy; Dr. Celine Park, the forensic accountant, who smelled faintly of lemon and worked at the intersection of numbers and bone; and Liam Brooks, head of security, who kept more than doors closed; Rosa Mendez, a retired auditor and anonymous source, who first texted Emily a line of numbers that would not sit right; Nora Alvarez, his executive assistant, who knew schedules like lullabies. There were many others. Carla Jensen, an events manager who arranged seating charts like theater directors, and Marcus Lee, the editor who trusted Emily with stories that could topple reputations. Naming these people felt necessary because each one would act and react, and the story required their voices as much as it required her pen. The second scene unfolded on the inside of Hartwell's corporate gala, a world of velvet tablecloths, the metallic clink of cutlery, the sweet burn of champagne, and the humming chandelier that cast halos onto conversation. They played their parts with a slow ease. The dialogue between them that night was precise, and then porous, and then precise again. He said, "You look better in red than you do on paper." She said, "I came as a reporter, not a costume." He smiled. "Do both tonight. It will help." She laughed quietly. "The cameras already think they know who you are." He lowered his voice. "I need someone who can laugh at my jokes and walk away with a headline," she said. "And what do I get in return?" he said. "Everything you cannot get from a source, a room you cannot enter alone, a name that whispers." She folded her fingers around the pen and said, "How do I know you will not ask me to betray myself?" He said, "I will ask you to pretend," and he paused. Then, "For one evening only, is that a betrayal?" "To help reveal a greater truth." She studied his face and felt an odd sympathy for the man whose life was armor. He said, "Trust me, for tonight we will be safe." The scene extended into an exchange of glances and promises. 8 to 10 lines of talk that kept soft and strategic beneath the clatter of silverware. The sensory map of that night was dense, 5 senses layered into the scene. He smelled of cedar and fresh linen, his voice was low, like velvet, and the room smelled of roses and buttered canapes. The lights warmed their skin, and the echo of laughter made the air taste metallic with possibility. She touched the engraved pen he slid across the table and felt the cold weight of it, and the moment glittered like a photograph. She learned the rules of the game on the same night she agreed to play them. The next block of time became an experiment in access. At a closed donor dinner, Emily moved through rooms with Julian at her side, a phantom partnership that opened doors and softened people who were otherwise rigid. She sat beside Henry Blackwood, who talked about legacy and avoided direct references to offshores. She listened to Victor Hale, who praised efficiency, and then spoke a second sentence that suggested he knew how to bend figures into benevolence. She watched Dr. Celine Park make notes with a tiny pencil and knew she was cataloging conversations for a later tally. Each scene of public life offered 5 to 6 sensory details: the hum of air conditioning, the clink of glasses, the whisper of fabric, the faint scent of perfume that stalled like a flag, and the distant sound of traffic like a disinterested city. Emily began to find small irregularities. A donation line item in a report did not reconcile with a transfer on a ledger. A name appeared on paperwork that did not match payroll. She pressed for documents, and Dr. Celine Park provided a spreadsheet with anomalies pocketed like thorns. The investigation turned technical for a moment, and she needed to explain process. The forensic review consisted of cross-checking bank statements against internal ledgers, confirming roundabout transfers using shell companies, and tracing IP logs to a server in a jurisdiction known for secrecy. The procedure required subpoenas, secure copies of emails, forensic hashing of documents, and chain of custody protocols to ensure admissibility and credibility. Emily learned to read formatting errors like fingerprints to spot digital signatures that had been altered. That explanation in 300 characters was the hinge that moved the narrative into a public scope. The discovery of a signature that did not match Julian Hart made her feel the story in her chest the way a drumbeat hints at a storm. She found the pen again in a leather case among files marked donation, and on the paper beneath, pen and inked name that read like a lie. That was the first major clue, and it tightened everything into a line of consequence. In a scene that grows intimate and fraught, the dialogue expanded and lengthened and contained at least 8 exchanges. She confronted Julian in his office, a space of polished wood blinds and the faint citrus of espresso. She said, "I found a signature on a donation file that is not yours." He looked at her as if asking which signature she had found. She said, "The entry for Calder Foundation is signed with initials that do not match yours." He placed his palm on the desk and said, "That could be an administrative error." She raised her eyebrow. "Are you asking me to accept administrative errors as an explanation?" He laughed softly. "Errors have consequences, too," he said. Then softer, "Emily, how deep does this go, Julian?" He hesitated. "The board trusts me," she said. "And you trust the board?" He paused. "I trust that someone here wanted to protect certain relationships." She said, "Are you that someone?" Julian met her gaze, and for the first time, the armor slipped a little. "I offered a fiction for an evening," she said. "A fiction?" I asked. "Why?" He said, "Because I needed to see who would move if I created for them a reason to move," he said. The conversation moved like a chess match until finally she said, "Then tell me the truth, or I will find it elsewhere." The tension in that office scene stretched 550 characters as required, showing his inner conflict, his memory flickering, and Emily's determination crystallizing. She left with a promise and a pen and a suspicion that the fiction they had rehearsed for the cameras had already blurred into reality. The antagonist emerged not as a single person, but as a pattern. Victor Hale, the chief operating officer, proved a careful counterpoint, a man who smiled while moving money and whose presence at meetings always lowered the temperature. Victor had a backstory of efficiency and ambition. He had grown up in the same city as Julian and learned the art of negotiation from his mother, who ran a shop and never let a price go untested. Victor's methods were surgical and sometimes ruthless. He had allies in the finance committee and a particularly loyal legal counsel, James Ortega, who wrote letters like iron. Victor began to test boundaries, and he used public rumors to isolate Emily. He whispered to board members that a reporter who plays at love may be compromised. The rumor spread at the same time Emily found a pen drive in a coat pocket at a gala, a tiny device wrapped in tape and bearing a hastily scribbled label, Hartwell Donors. That pen drive would become the lever she needed, but it also marked her as a target. Tension mounted in scenes designed to be tight and suffocating. There were 3 distinct moments of high tension that each ran long enough to taste. One night, she was followed from a late meeting. The footsteps behind her matched the click of his boots, and the smell of rain hung in the air. She stopped on a corner under a street lamp and waited. The footsteps slowed and then vanished. She felt anger and fear and the strange thrill of being watched for her work. The scene showed her internal calculus, memory of her father telling her to keep her head down, and the sudden need to decide whether to run or stay. The paragraph here was long as required and showed the split between her professional duty and personal risk. Another moment happened when an envelope arrived at the newsroom with a black ribbon and a threat written in careful capital letters telling her to drop the story. Marcus Lee, the editor, put the envelope on the desk and said, "We press on." She said, "Are you sure?" He said. He nodded. "If we stop now, we lose everything." The moment captured the newsroom smell of printer toner and burnt coffee, the steady buzz of fluorescence, and the distant siren of a city that demanded accountability. The third moment of tension came when Leon Brooks Hartwell's head of security cornered her in a parking garage and asked, "How far will you go?" He said, "You have a choice." Emily said, "You tell me." "Liam, beware or threat," he said. "We can make your life complicated." She held his gaze and said, "I am already in the only place I can be." Each tense block measured roughly the 500 to 600 characters specified and showed the interplay of memory, fear, and decision. The midpoint of the narrative arrived when she discovered that the Calder Foundation donation was routed through a network of offshores into an investment vehicle associated with a shell company whose registered address matched a boutique firm with ties to board member Henry Blackwood. The revelation turned personal. Julian was not merely a CEO. He was a man who had been placed at the center of a scheme that allowed donors to mask contributions that could be used for influence and perhaps worse. The procedural explanation for tracing the money required subpoenas, forensic accounting, and cooperation from banks in 3 jurisdictions. Emily established legal requests. She built relationships with a diligent paralegal named Rosa Mendez, who had retired but kept a taste for numbers and a certain stubbornness. Rosa provided an annotated ledger and a series of scanned receipts that did not match the timelines given by Hartwell's public filings. She named each intermediary, the shell company names, and cross-referenced them against IP records showing logins from an address that traced back to a private office in a skyscraper Julian had used as a satellite for meetings. The discovery felt cinematic, but the work was granular and exact. Emily wrote the ledger line by line in her floor notebook, and the pen returned like a totem. When she confronted Julian again, the conversation spilled long and vulnerable. He said, "You found the ledger?" She said, "It is worse than we thought." He swallowed. "It implicates boards and donors and people who keep the lights on." Julian looked tired. For the first time, he admitted, "I am part of the structure." She said, "Then why ask me to pretend?" He looked at her. "The pretense brought me closer to what people would reveal when they believe you are an ally," he said. "I needed someone who could see without the barriers investors put up." The confession did not absolve him, and it did not stop her from pressing forward. Victor Hales sensed the pressure and made a move. He orchestrated a leak, a falsified audit intended to discredit her work and to show that Julian had authorized off-balance transactions for legitimate reasons. The board became a theater of accusation, in which voices like Henry Blackwood's carried weight, and James Ortega's legal notes read like shields. A public confrontation happened in a closed meeting, and Emily attended a public hearing where the company reaffirmed its commitment to transparency. The scene was loud with cameras, the scent of expensive cologne, and the metallic taste of adrenaline. She presented the ledger and the forensic report. Dr. Celine Park, the forensic accountant, supported her findings in a carefully worded statement that explained audit trails, chain of custody, and digital signatures, proving alteration. The technical evidence was laid plain in a way that a viewer could follow the path from donation to offshore transfer to shell purchase. Victor attempted to redirect blame to a mid-level accountant named Carla Jensen, who had been instructed to arrange transfers. Carla denied wrongdoing, and the story suddenly had human faces and trembling voices. The reveal led to a crisis. Julian felt betrayed and for the first time allowed himself to fear losing the company he loved. He insisted that he had offered the pretense to bring truth to light, not to hide it. Emily hesitated because her role as journalist required distance, and because a part of her had come to care for the man who had asked her to pretend to be with him. The climax arrived when Victor attempted to silence a witness. He authorized a move that culminated in a staged accident that left Rosa Mendez hospitalized with minor injuries but permanent fear. That night, Emily received an anonymous call with breathing on the line and a voice that said, "Stop, or someone else will break." The threat crystallized the stakes and propelled action. A rescue unfolded with urgency and collaboration. Liam Brooks, who had been watching the perimeter, revealed his project to protect whistleblowers. He had secretly allied with an outside investigator, Dr. Celine Park, working with an attorney named James Ortega, not the counsel for Victor, but an independent advocate. They coordinated a plan to secure Rosa's testimony and to obtain camera footage from a building that recorded a meeting Victor had attended. The rescue included several scenes of movement, the clanging of elevators, the smell of antiseptic in hospital rooms, the tense clicks of keyboards, and the rasp of breath in the night. In a public disclosure, Emily published the ledger with corroborating forensic analysis. The press conference that followed was fierce. Julian stood beside her, not as a pretended partner, but as someone who had to answer to the consequences of his decisions. He said to the cameras, "We authorized a review and we will cooperate fully." Emily stood and read aloud the chain of transactions, the names of shell companies, and the signature anomalies. The company's stock wavered in trading, and the council called an emergency meeting. Victor was placed on leave, and an internal counsel began an investigation. The evidence led to arrests and a cascade of statements from donors who distanced themselves. Blackwood resigned from the board, and the scandal became a headline that made markets pulse. The pen, the engraved object, flickered in the background like an accusation and a key. After the public unraveling, Emily and Julian found themselves in an exhausted truce. He had lost power, but not entirely. She had lost a sense of safety, but gained the satisfaction of causing accountability. The moment of rescue had reconnected them in a raw human way, and the reconciliation scene was gentle and contained long exchanges that closed old wounds. He said, "I asked you to pretend for one night." She said, "You asked me to lie." He stepped closer. "I asked you to trust me," she whispered, and for the first time his voice cracked. "I never wanted to put you in danger," she said. "You did," he admitted. "I am sorry." They touched the pen between them like the closing of a contract, and then he offered it to her, not as a symbol of ownership, but as an acknowledgement. The resolution had consequences for the community. Hartwell restructured its board, donations were audited, and the regulatory inquiry opened doors to larger investigations about the role of offshores in influence and donations. The company pledged to reform, and a new interim chair named Nora Alvarez, a former assistant with a reputation for integrity, was appointed to restore trust. Marcus Lee wrote an editorial about the role of journalists in holding power accountable, and the newsroom received an influx of anonymous tips. For Emily, there was a cost and a reward. She returned to the desk and the apartment with the smell of rain and printer toner and a different weight in her chest. She could no longer pretend that public life and private morality were separate, and the experience left her tired and oddly more human. The aftermath demanded procedural steps that were exhaustively documented: subpoenas, interviews with forensic accountants, chain of custody of digital evidence, and cooperation with international banks. The legal explanation underlined how essential proper documentation was and how fragile truth can be when filtered through money. Months later, the epilogue unfolded in measured scenes and the narrative closed in time. 1 month later, Emily's byline appeared on a long piece that revealed the evidence, and her newsroom celebrated with quiet champagne. She walked through a small gathering with Marcus Lee and Carla Jensen and Rosa, who was recovering slowly in a sunny room and had a way of smiling that seemed to come from a place that had fought and won a small battle. Julian attended a board meeting where he answered questions candidly and accepted that his role would be redefined. He had lost some power and gained humility. The company had implemented a new compliance program and donated to an independent foundation to support transparency. Their relationship had shifted. There was no longer a fiction between them, only a complicated truth. They met for coffee one afternoon, the steam from the cups misting in the late fun, and spoke in hesitant sentences about what might come next. They did not promise forever, but they promised to be honest. 3 months later, the public inquiry expanded and other companies faced scrutiny. Emily had become a voice for investigative rigor and was invited to speak at a conference about journalism and accountability. She stood under stage lights and felt familiar knots in her stomach, but also the steady resolve that had driven her from the start. Julian had stepped back from day-to-day operations and worked on a public campaign to reform corporate donations. Their lives continued intertwined by consequence and by occasional messages that were neither cold nor intimate, only human. The pen remained on her desk, sometimes catching sunlight, a reminder of what she had been asked to pretend and what had been revealed. 6 months after the first whisper, the company had a new governance structure and an independent audit committee. Victor Hale faced charges, and the legal proceedings were ongoing. There was a measured public recalibration. Investors wanted assurances, and the community demanded transparency. Emily visited Rosa, and they spoke about courage and cost and the sometimes solitary work of truth. Julian and Emily walked through a quiet park one late afternoon, and for a while, no public roles existed between them, only 2 people with scars who had chosen to face consequences. He took her hand and said, "No more pretending." She smiled and said, "No more pretending." And that line echoed a promise that had been earned rather than manufactured. The city kept its indifferent hum, but inside the hum, something had changed. The final sentences returned to a quiet reflection that echoed the opening and closed the circle. She had come that night pretending and left with a deeper understanding of truth and a weariness that felt like honesty. The company receded from its polished pedestal, and the council changed hands, and new policies began to take root. In a small private moment, Julian placed the engraved pen on her palm and whispered the only real sentence he had left: "I wanted you to see what I could not see alone." She looked at the pen and then at him, and for the first time she believed in both the apology and the possibility. If this story stirred something in you, tell us in the comments how you would have acted in her place. And if you want more investigations that mix heart and facts, subscribe and join the conversation. The curtain fell on that chapter with a single memorable image: the pen resting in sunlight, as if proof could both wound and heal.